Welcome everyone to this special briefing brought to you today by our friends and colleagues at the Progressive Israel Network, a coalition of 10 progressive Jewish American groups including NIF, J Street and Americans for Peace Now. My name is Liam Gatroy, I'm the Executive Director of NIF Australia, and I want to begin our event today by acknowledging that I'm on Aboriginal land, the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I want to pay my respect to elders past and present and acknowledge here that sovereignty has never been ceded. I'm going to give just a short introduction today before passing it on to our host and moderator for today, my NIF colleague, Libby Lenkinski. The conversation today will be focusing on the residents of the Masafer Yatta area of the West Bank in the South Hebron Hills. I was there just 2 weeks ago, where more than 1,000 Palestinians live. 40 years ago, the Israeli military declared the area to be a firing zone, a military training area. And since that time, legal efforts led by our flagship grantee, the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, ACRI, have been trying to lift the threat of home demolitions, evictions and dispossession, which has hung over the residents since that time. The Army's declaration of that firing zone was finally upheld by Israel's High Court just a couple of months ago, which gave permission for the Army to permanently evict Palestinian residents, something that has already begun. With US President Joe Biden currently on the ground visiting Israel and Palestine, attempting a little bit of a reset after the Trump years, our experienced panel will give a bit of an overview about this region and what to expect next. To that panel now, which features Sarit Michaeli, B'Tselem's International Advocacy Officer, Roni, Pelli, a senior lawyer at ACRI working on cases in the occupied territories, and Oren Ziv, an Israeli photojournalist. Thank you again for joining us, and now passing it on to Libby.
Welcome. I'm Libby Lenkinski from New Israel Fund, and I'll be moderating today's webinar about Masafer Yatta. So glad to see so many of you for this important conversation. On behalf of the Progressive Israel Network, PIN, which brings together organizations representing Americans who are committed to pursuing democracy, equality, and peace in Israel, which is the majority. This coalition provides a strong, unified voice in support of its members' common goals of democracy and equal rights, religious freedom and pluralism, an end to the occupation, two-state solution, etc. The network includes Amenu, Americans for Peace Now, Habonim Dror, Hashomer Hatzeir, Jewish Labor Committee, J Street, New Israel Fund, Partners for Progressive Israel, Reconstructing Judaism, and Trua. Today, we're going to talk about Masafer Yatta, a topic which has gained international interest and coverage in the media over the past months. Many of the organizations on this call and part of Progressive Israel Network have already held briefings about Masafer Yatta following the Israeli High Court decision to allow the Army to use the area as a firing zone after 22 years of litigation. This webinar today is timed to coincide with American President Joe Biden's trip to Israel, and it will serve as an update on where things stand for this specific area of the West Bank and in general about things going on related to the occupation and settlements. This will be an update from the Israeli human rights and Israeli activism journalism documentation perspective. It is meant to keep this issue on our collective agenda here and there. This week, in addition to this webinar, the full gamut of Progressive Israel Network groups, along with the Union for Reform Judaism, the New York Jewish Agenda, and the National Council for Jewish Women, sent a letter to President Biden urging him to stop the forced displacement of Palestinians who live in Masafer Yatta. And there is also an issue brief about this being released today by J Street on this topic that we'll try to make available in the chat. You will probably notice that there are not Palestinian speakers on this call, not residents of the area. And while many of our groups are in regular contact with residents of Masafer Yatta, and while our speakers work hand in hand with residents of Masafer Yatta and other Palestinian activists, there are a lot of political as well as time pressures on these leaders at this moment. And this space with so many groups participating was a tricky one. So we're focusing the conversation on the Israeli advocacy angle and things that our groups and our partners on the ground are doing to keep this issue on the public agenda also in Israel in a variety of ways. So as I mentioned, I'm Libby Lenkinski, and the subject of our webinar today, the crisis facing residents of Masafer Yatta, also known as Firing Zone 918. It's an honor to moderate this call. We will be hearing from Active Stills co-founder and photojournalist Oren Ziv, who will share some of his photographs with us from Masafer Yatta, just to ground us in who the people are, what the place looks like. Sometimes these things can feel very remote, and we're hoping that through Oren's moving and gripping photography and analysis, we can get a little bit closer to the ground. And we will then have a conversation with Sarit, Michaeli, and Roni Pelli from B'Tselem and ACRI, along with Oren, and we'll leave time at the end for Q&A. So to ask a question, please use the Q&A function in your Zoom platform at any point during the call, and I'll be trying to monitor what's in there. I'll do my best to do so. If you're using the chat function, I'm not going to be monitoring that for the actual Q&A that's part of this webinar, but you can feel free to interact with each other. To bring us into this conversation, I'll remind us where Masafer Yatta is. It's quite remote and in the desert. It's in Area C of the West Bank, which our speakers will address. And it's thought of as part of the South Hebron Hills area. And it's hot. I was there just a couple of weeks ago, visiting the villages that we're talking about today with the groups that are briefing us today, with ACRI and with B'Tselem. And it's quite an experience to get there on this broken road that keeps getting demolished into a hilly desert place that is very hot and very exposed. So without further ado, and to help visualize the people in place, I'm honored to hand the floor over to Oren. As I mentioned, Oren is the co-founder of Active Stills Collective. Since 2005, he's been documenting social and political issues in Israel and in the occupied Palestinian territories. He's a staff reporter and photographer for 972 magazine and Local Call, the Hebrew version, and freelancing for local and international media all the time. He's been photographing for the last 15 years activist groups, local struggles in Israel, Palestine, collaborating with NGOs and human rights organizations in the region. His work has been featured everywhere: the New York Times, Vice, Al Jazeera, Der Spiegel, and many, many others. Oren holds an MA in research and forensic architecture from Goldsmiths in London. His work has been presented also in museums all over the Tate Britain, Tel Aviv Art Museum, Haifa Art Museum, and many others. So, Oren, thank you very much for being with us. Let's move on to you and your photographs to get us started here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'll just share the screen so we can start. Can you see the photos? It's fine.
It looks like we can see them. Yes, please.
Okay, great. So, as you said, the main challenge for us, the photographers who don't live on the place, even for West Bank photographers who live in Hebron, which is 40 kilometers away, is the fact the area is remote and it's very easy for the army to control the few roads that are there. You need a 4x4 vehicle to enter, and wherever there's a military training, demolition or military activity, it's very easy for them to block a few roads and to prevent access. This is why activists, but also journalists, have been sleeping there or arriving really early to the 8 communities that are in the fire zone, and to the communities around that are in the part of the fire zone that is not in use at the moment. This is from the village of El Majaz. And of course, as you said, the conditions are very, very tough. No running water. People get their water either from wells that are being demolished by the army from time to time, or by water tanks, which of course make it much, much more expensive. And the nearby illegal outposts, of course, get electricity and water and all the services from the Israeli authority. It's important also to state, and I'm sure Sarit and Roni will elaborate it, all these communities are in Area C, which are under Israeli control, and Israel should be responsible for the facilities and this kind of services. And part of the pressure of the army and the civil administration is demolitions. And since the High Court ruling, in May, we've seen an increase in the number of demolitions in the area. This is a part of the important part of the documentation. It's not only the daily life and the demolitions and the military activity, but also the struggle of the residents together with Israeli and international activists to protest this situation. And the Supreme, this is from the Supreme Court hearing, one of the last hearings a few months ago, that the residents, or at least the ones of them who could get permits to enter Jerusalem, came to the court. And the hearing, of course, was happening in Hebrew, so people had to get their own, it wasn't translated by the court, so the residents themselves couldn't understand the procedure. They had to, some activists were translating from them, but the court itself didn't do it. And I'm sure Roni can elaborate on this more, but although the court didn't accept it fully, the residents brought with them different documentation that shows that they were living there much before Israel occupied the West Bank in '67. This is a booklet of someone someone who had a grocery shop, and he was writing what he was selling and how much people owed him. And this is from the 30s or the 40s. This is the writing from the grocery shop. And unfortunately, the court didn't accept the fact that the residents were there before Israel and before the area was declared as a training zone. And following the court ruling, the military announced a training of 1 month. This was the first day of the training. It happens 3 days a week, and it happens quite close to the villages, to the houses of people. People can hear the sounds, the dust, sometimes the smoke, and the training with live ammunition, training that didn't happen for dozens of years in the area. And the training is still ongoing. It's supposed to finish, to end next week. These are residents in Jimba looking at the training. And this is in El Majaz. And of course, even the fire zone is a huge area, but the army is insisting on training near the people's houses. And this is a training that happened almost a year ago. And back then also the army drove through the communities. This is again the village of Jimba, drove through the small roads between the houses, near children, near schools. In this training, maybe because of the public attention, they're not doing so. It's a bit further away, but still very close. And also following the court ruling last month, there was a big group of Jews from the US and from the UK with Israeli activists, together with local Palestinian activists, that came to open one of the roads leading to Masafer Yatta, to the fire zone. This road was actually blocked by the settlers of Mitzpeh Yair, a legal outpost that is in the fire zone, but not in the active part of it. And the settlers blocked it because they didn't want Palestinians passing near their illegal settlement. The activists tried to open the road. Of course, the army was not so happy about it and dispersed them using stun grenades and tear gas and detaining a few people. And at the end of this action, when people were leaving, one settler attacked a group of Israeli activists that were driving with their car away. In this case, because it was documented from outside, but also from inside the car, the police actually arrested him and charged him. But this is, of course, a rare occasion. Usually settler violence is not treated by the authorities. Here we can see one of the commanders, one of the generals of the area, with a settler, probably a soldier on vacation, that is going with his weapon to confront the demonstrator. It was on the same demonstration, just in a different part. And you can see how the army is escorting him in a nice way. And when we're talking about Masafer Yatta and in general the South Hebron area, the army is taking an active part, not only by protecting the settlers and allowing attacks to happen, but also like in this case, forcing away shepherds and their animals from the land around. This is near the illegal outpost of Avigail, also in the area. And also detaining shepherds and activists and people who come to document. This is one of the maybe harshest cases I document last year, when 5 Palestinian kids between the age of 8 and 12 were arrested, not in the fire zone, but really next to it, when they were going to pick a kub, a Palestinian plant, a seasonal plant. They were picking it near the settlement, and they were arrested and detained by the police for a few hours. And they later also were called for interrogation. This is afterwards when we interviewed them. And another in the edge of the fire zone in Mufakara, or in the non-active part of the fire zone, where a brutal settler attack took place, injuring a 3-year-old kid and damaging car and houses and water tanks. This was also last year, part of the daily reality there. And if we talk about Palestinian activists and journalists there, so this is my colleague Basel Al-Adra, that lives in Atwani near the fire zone, and is documenting daily the events there. And because of his documentation, he was accused by the army that he himself set fire to accuse the settlers. This was, of course, false, but the army and some settler organization managed to get this fake news on Israel's most popular channel 12, which later apologized. But of course, it took them a few months to apologize and to take this claim down. And also Palestinian journalists from the area and from around are on daily risk of getting arrested, getting detained, because the army doesn't always respect their press cards, and just because they're Palestinian and they're there on a daily basis, they're frequently arrested or detained. And just to end this short presentation, these are people I recommend to follow the work. So Basel Al-Adra, that writes together with me 972 and Local Call, and lives there. And also Omri, that is an activist, like many other Israeli and Jewish activists, that spends time there, sleeps there, documents the daily events there. Sorry. And also Emily Glick, another photographer and activist that spends a lot of time in the area. So just to end this short presentation, I think, as I said, a lot of the obstacles is the distance and the ability of the army to block people and to block the information. And luckily, because the work of many activists and people on the ground, the information and photos and videos are coming all the time, day and night, from all the activities that the army and the authorities and the settlers are doing that, but with a lot of risk and a lot of price that mostly the Palestinian activists and journalists are paying.
Oren, thank you so much. I am going to keep us moving from this presentation and say I did see some questions about where to find the reportage that Oren was mentioning from Palestinian, Israeli, and international colleagues. And so we will, I think actually Itamar has already posted in the chat some links to Basel Adra's reportage on 972 magazine, which is a resource that we all recommend using, and we'll continue to post things in the chat that relate to both Oren and, sorry, go ahead.
I will send as well some things. I would say.
Wonderful. Thank you, Oren. And with that, I'm going to move us into a conversation also with Sarit Michaeli of B'Tselem and Roni Pelli of ACRI. So Roni Pelli joined ACRI in 2013 as a legal intern. She returned to ACRI in 2015 as an attorney in the Human Rights in the Occupied Palestinian Territories Department. Roni began working in the human rights field in 2002 at Hamoked, the Center for the Defense of the Individual, and later in the research department of Yesh Din. She subsequently worked at the international human rights lawyer Michael Sfard's office, focusing on human rights law. She's currently a board member of Akivot, the Research Institute for the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. She has a BA in East Asian Studies from Hebrew U and a law degree from the College of Law and Business in Ramat Gan. So Roni is very embedded in our partners and grantees, both for New Israel Fund, but also Progressive Israel Network groups at large. Welcome, Roni. Sarit Michaeli is B'Tselem's International Advocacy Officer. She's been with B'Tselem since October 2004, serving as the organization's media spokesperson and director of public outreach prior to her current role. Sarit also documents demonstrations in the West Bank with a focus on Israeli security forces' misuse of crowd control weapons. She really has like a museum of these kinds of bullets and weapons that are being used and can describe really all of them. It's quite a thing. Prior to joining B'Tselem, Sarit worked extensively in the fields of journalism, graphic design, and translation in her native Israel and overseas in London and in New York. In addition, she has been active in social change movements all over. So welcome, Sarit. Roni, I'm gonna come to you for an update about where legal action is right now. We also got a question about this in the Q&A, like, hello, isn't anyone taking this to the Supreme Court? So I wanna ask you what's the latest with the legal situation. I know that the month of July has been full of Army trainings all over, and that ACRI filed both a request for yet another hearing and more recently an interim injunction because the Army drills have been dangerous for residents. So what can you tell us about where things stand today and what's going on both with the 22-year case and then more recent legal action?
Okay, so yeah, the 22 years case is just, it's ended. It ended in the beginning of May, and with this really extremely difficult and not very, how would I say it politely? We found a lot of mistakes in this ruling. Therefore, we did file a request for rehearing, a petition for rehearing. And yesterday, we got the decision from court that the state has to respond to this request for rehearing until the beginning of August. I think August the 2nd or 3rd, I don't remember, but really the beginning of August, which is quite soon when we're talking about Supreme Court, Israeli Supreme Court terms. And we did file 2 requests for interim injunctions. The first one was court said that it doesn't see the need because of the Army's obligations. They said that they'll do everything they can not to harm the population, that they will not enforce the closed military zone over the people who live there. And they said that they're very careful with the firing next to people's villages, and that they will not harm fields or will not try their best not to go through villages. Because I think that the pictures that Oren showed from last year's training were very, very shocking. I think, so court said, okay, if that's what you're planning, please go ahead. And we were waiting to see what happened. And in the first week, I think, Sarit, correct me if I'm wrong, but they tried their best not to harm and not to stop people from not to harm people there, not to close the roads, to let people move more or less around the area, not to shoot around villages. That was the first week. Although it began with putting targets on people's private property, but it was kind of a mistake, and they didn't really use it. They put it on a water tank. It was, but it did more or less everything. In the second week, it was different. We saw pictures of the heavy tools riding over the fields. They did start massive shooting around the villages, but still it seems like and the freedom of movement was really not the same. Like people were detained and people couldn't leave their villages. And then in the beginning of the third week, there was this suddenly a family that was sitting in her home in Khalet El Daba just heard a noise, and a bullet came into their roof. So we called the army really fast, like the minute we knew about it, and they stopped training in these days, and they asked us to give them the exact location. We gave them the exact location, and then they went to check it. And from the press, we understood that they said, well, it's not us. And we said, okay, someone was firing on this house and you're training here, like 3 kilometers away. How can you come? And he said, no, we didn't. It's not, it doesn't make any sense. We draw a triangle. This is where the shooting is supposed to be. It's outside of the triangle. Yeah, but it's in imaginary lines. Okay. And then we heard that they will keep training without really checking it seriously. And we were it was very stressful because it's really dangerous. So we turned to court again and we asked for another interim injunction. And what they did there is they said, well, they're about the fields and the restrictions of movement. It said, well, it's just not true. Although we showed photos of tanks on, yellow field. And about the bullet, what they said is that we were trying to calculate it, and we're not sure it's from the army, so we will not. But just in case, we're taking more security measures. What we did in this request is we said, okay, a day after this shooting, there was a very big visit of diplomats, and during this visit, they found this bullet, which is not a regular M16 bullet. It's a much bigger one, which is shot from heavy tool, from a tank or some other kind of heavy tools. And what we asked some activists to bring it to us, and we said, okay, we have the bullet, please come and get it and investigate the situation, and then you'll know for sure it's yours. Okay, and you also know where it was fired from. So, and they never respond to it, not even when we wrote it to court. They're just not interested. So what court said is, today we got another decision, and court said, well, until Sunday, and we also said, well, it's a Muslim holiday. Please don't. You're training during Muslim holiday when they cannot visit their relatives, they cannot leave their homes. It's not. There is no way. And they said, well, we will not train during this week, in the end of the week, which is a Muslim holiday, but also a visit of the US president. So they didn't say it, but we all know it. So the situation now is that we got another decision today, 2 hours ago that they have to update about the special security measures that they took, the extra measures, by Sunday, 4 o'clock. So this is where it stands now. So now they have to update the measures, and we asked to respond to this. So we'll see.
Thank you so much. I mean, that's a lot. And thank you for that briefing. And I particularly want to sort of pick up where you ended about, like, I think all three of you, actually, Roni, Sarit, and Oren, do understand the way in which, in the Israeli context and also internationally, on the ground activism, documentation, legal action, and advocacy action is all connected and has a relationship to one another, even if people are sort of tackling it in different, the context of Joe Biden's visit has an impact on the perceptions of the courts and the media and all of these things, and vice versa. So I want to sort of move from this more legal kind of trajectory and turn to you, Sarit. You also do some of the legal sort of analysis, if not legal action, but I want to turn to you and talk about why the Army made these decisions in the first place. Why did the Army try to pursue this in the first place? Do they really need more space for military training? And like, what has been I'm sort of asking you a very big question now, but what has been over time and up until today the response of Palestinian residents, the relationship of Israeli activists and human rights work to this? And then also, because we're here with a group of American organizations, because President Biden is there right now, and because a lot of us have been engaged in trying to get some, international statements, things like that, where do you see that fitting into the picture as well? And Barbara asked this question from J-Link in Canada, partner always trying to raise these issues as well. So like what has been done in that realm and what could be done now, sort of tying in the international angle, the Israeli and the Palestinian around this. But first start with just like, why did the Army decide to do this ever?
Well, I mean, I think it's become clear recently, also with the addition of more historical research, both by Akivot and other colleagues like Yuval Avraham from Local Call, another really wonderful independent journalist that really dug into the archives to see why Israel initially designated these vast areas of the West Bank as training grounds. And the bottom line, and Itamar, maybe you'd want to put some links to these reporting again here so people can read it, because it's a very, obviously a complex, long picture historically. But the bottom line is that the military has always used training as a way of removing Palestinians, of keeping Palestinians out of these areas. And this is across the board throughout the West Bank, not just in Masafer Yatta. In fact, Masafer Yatta is a little tiny, small firing zone in comparison with massive areas throughout the northern Jordan Valley, for example, that have been designated firing zones. So this is something that I think we all need to be aware of. The ultimate goal, and we have to be open about this because, it's so clear. The ultimate goal is to remove Palestinians from these areas, to remove the indigenous population of Masafer Yatta that has lived in these areas for years, dozens of years, certainly in a very, very organized way, hundreds of years as these kind of like periodic seasonal herding grounds for the population of Yatta, to basically make sure that they cannot live on their land. And what is happening now with this military training is a great example, great in a terrible way, obviously, but an excellent example of these dynamics. Everything that Israel has done to the residents of Masafer Yatta up until now, which is to prevent them from actually being able to build anything legally and expose them to humanitarian disasters that stem from the fact that they're prohibited from, getting water in pipes and getting electricity and dealing with all of that and exposing them to unchecked settler violence, right? All of this that the international community refers to as the coercive environment, now they have to endure beyond all of these things, the isolation and the pressure and the fear and the danger, the risk of death and injury of this training. And everything the army said it wouldn't do, right, in the very meager promises they made, commitments they made to the High Court, they've done, right? And this is, in a way, also quite symbolic, because when we complained, and when I say we, I mean our broad community of activists, Palestinians, Israelis, complained to the Israeli authorities about a bullet fired from a heavy machine gun hitting a residential home, the first response they had was to deny it happened, right? It's basically like, well, according to our laws and our calculations and our plan for the training, this couldn't have happened. But it did happen. And it's a bit like when the Palestinians of Masafer Yatta had to prove to the Israeli occupation authorities that they have lived in these areas for so many years, right? Even long before the Israeli occupation. That still didn't prevent the High Court from, flicking off their petition and just kind of like just removing it as if it was some kind of small bother, right? But this is the dynamic that applies throughout the West Bank. And I think it's very important that we're always aware of this. And one of the things I want to say, the reason we know so much about every single incident that has occurred in Masafer Yatta, the isolation, the cars are being confiscated with thousands and thousands of shekels of fines, and so many different barriers are being constructed that to isolate these communities, one from another and from their kind of like broader community. All of this we know so well because of these incredible activists, Palestinian residents and Palestinian independent journalists and Israeli activists who are sending us all of this information and filming and doing it in real time. But in other parts of the West Bank that are a bit more isolated, or where there's less of this kind of long-term activism, unfortunately, similar dynamics are taking place. And we see the terrible results of this. And I just want to mention one of these communities. It's called Ras Tin. It's a Bedouin community northeast of Ramallah. And about a week ago, some of the families have decided they simply cannot endure any more settler violence. They've been exposed to 2 years of intense violent attacks by Israeli settlers, basically acting like the KKK, literally setting fire to their tents and to their fodder again and again, and everything with the support, the acquiescence, the turning a blind eye of the army. These communities have decided they've given up. They simply cannot live anymore in these places under these daily threats and physical attacks and manufactured arrests that then lead them to having to pay massive amounts of bail money, and also additional confiscations and demolitions by the Israeli authorities. So I'm giving it as an example of an area which we should also be paying attention to, and I think everyone in this meeting should also think about, and the kind of like, maybe just to connect this to the broader dynamics of President Biden's visit. I think Masafer Yatta is if Israel will move ahead and literally remove the people from Masafer Yatta, or what they've already been doing, right? Which is so egregious that if that eventually gets these communities to give up and leave, this will be such a massive human rights violation and war crime. And it's very clear why so many American and North American and international politicians and representatives have been so open and so willing to challenge US government policy on this, and reaching out to Secretary Blinken and to President Biden on these issues. There has been quite a lot of action in Washington DC and in the US, and I think it's welcome. And if one message that I can really convey to all of our friends here on the call is that you need to continue to do this, because we have to reach the situation where something, if Israel is simply acting as if it does not have any restrictions, and this is what we are seeing on the ground, on an issue that is like the most egregious probably, and the most famous, and the most kind of like motivating human rights violation that we have currently, then it unfortunately means that we're not doing enough, but it also means that the United States is clearly not doing enough. And I think when President Biden refers to Israel as a democracy and kind of like continues to promote uncritical relationship, uncritical support, these are all things that American Jews need to be resisting, need to be helping spread the word about. Maybe I'll end here and we can kind of continue and talk about other issues as well.
Just one quick question that came in from the Q&A that I want to ask, which is whether there are Jewish settlements in the firing zone, and if so, how are they being dealt with?
There are Jewish settlements that are kind of, that some of the houses are in the firing zone, but not in the active one. In 2012, there was the Minister of Defense decided to divide the area to two. The area which is it's closer to the settlement was declared as non-fire firing zone, and it was, and people who live there can stay there. So it means that the settlements can stay there, but also Tuba and Fakra and some of the Palestinian villages. But unlike the settlements, it doesn't mean that Israel will plant them or give them access to water or to electricity or anything. Just they don't officially trying to get them out of them.
Yeah, thank you. I'm coming back to you, Roni, since I'm already with you. And we've talked about this, and people on this call have received information from whether it's us or J Street or Peace Now or any number of groups, or from, ACRI and B'Tselem directly in English. But like I keep saying, like, you've been litigating, ACRI litigated this case for 22 years, and like you kind of walked through that, but like, that's a long time. That's more than the amount of time that I think any of us have actually even been working on this issue, and just because of our age, or maybe not. But what is that normal? Why did it take so long? And like, are other cases that are related to Area C taking this long?
No, it's a unique case. I have to say that Danya Kier is our legal advisor. Is with them from the very beginning, from day one. And it's what happened is that the first petitions that were filed in 2000, they were just waiting for the state's response. And the state proposed, just ask for, give us 6 more months, give us 1 more year. And when they had to respond, all they said is, well, we're going to divide it into these 2 areas. So, and then we had to file a new one, a new petition, because now it's a different situation. It's only 8 villages and not 12. But yes, I think no one really wanted to get this decision. Court really, really wanted us to agree, or to get some. We've been to several negotiations. Although it was quite clear that the residents would never agree to give up their, homes or properties or land, but they kept saying us, well, they offered that they won't train during this and these times. You offered nothing. We have nothing to offer. So no one wanted to see this again, this scene of people who are brought into trucks and going out. No one will. Court usually does not rule against the army. Therefore, they really, 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 really badly put a lot of pressure for the communities to settle on something. but it's impossible because it's a 1-0 game. There is no, so yeah, and I believe that this was the main thing.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you another question, Sarit, and I think if Oren is still with us, maybe we can bring him back as well, because I'm already seeing that some of the questions in the Q&A were in relation to the photos that Oren shared. But Sarit, I want to ask you a little bit about the humanitarian and human rights perspective, both based on like what's currently happening, which you talked about, but also in the case of expulsion, just from in humanitarian law and just humanitarian perspective, what would that mean? And then I also, while I'm at it, there's a question in the Q&A from somebody who seems to have visited Masafer Yatta and saw their solar panels and wanted to know what's the story. Were they built by the EU? How do residents and activists so, you know, what's livelihood like in Masafer Yatta, and how do people protect the things that they've built there, like solar panels and water, you know, systems and things like that? So both on the humanitarian side of expulsion and also just like that infrastructure that does exist, where is it from and how does it get protected?
Sure. So maybe I'll just say, you know, I'm not a legal expert, but I think it's very clear, and obviously if Roni can expand, but like, it's also not like a very, very complex international humanitarian law thinking. It's the total axiomatic, broad-based, universal decision that removing protected people, i.e. the Palestinians, from their land, from their home in the occupied area is a war crime. And if Israel manages to, through the use of this coercive environment, right, through all of these measures that are aimed at getting these people to just get so tired and leave as if there's somewhere they can actually go to, this would be a war crime. This means Israeli decision makers responsible for this will be individually criminally accountable, or should be held individually criminally accountable. But unfortunately, we know that the situation currently is not that there is any real mechanism to do that, and that certainly the international community is very hesitant to support the International Criminal Court investigation into the situation in Palestine. The United States doesn't support it, and it should, like it's doing in other places, right? For example, in the Ukraine. In any case, what I want to say, though, in terms of like the life in the Masafer is extremely hard, because instead of actually providing for these communities like Israel's obligation under international law should lead it to do, it does the opposite. It not only, it prevents, shirks its responsibilities, stops people there from getting its assistance, and you know, it sounds a bit insane even to talk about it this way, because we know that Israel has never adhered to international humanitarian law. It's always utilized international humanitarian law as a very, very in a very utilitarian way, simply in order to promote its own goals of taking over as much Palestinian land as possible with as few Palestinians on it. But so instead of actually supporting and providing for these Palestinians, Israel is stopping them from providing for themselves. And when they build, Israel comes and demolishes. The Israeli authorities have complete control over this area, because aside from it being a firing zone, right, a military training ground, it's also part of Area C, that under the temporary Oslo Accords that have been kind of the longest temporary thing we've had in our region, right, that they were meant to last 5 years, Israel still has full control over all of the planning in this area, and it uses the control in order to limit, to basically de-develop the area. So what we have is we have Palestinians, and we have international humanitarian organizations, and we have the European Union supporting these communities against forcible transfer, right? So giving them things that should be so basic, like, you know, having basic electricity or water, or very, very rudimentary homes, that people need, because their families are growing and people need to live and do and exist on their land. And then Israel comes and demolishes or confiscates this. And if you think I have criticism over the United States government's policies vis-a-vis Israel, well, I also am very critical, and we are also very critical of the European Union's policies, because the European Union also, even though the European Union is the funder, together with member states, of most, I would say, of the humanitarian infrastructure in the Masafer, including schools and clinics and a lot of other things that people need to live their lives. Even though the European Union funds it, the European Union is not willing to take the right kind of action when Israel destroys it. And the right kind of action is political action. It's not just about making statements. It's about taking action that will, demonstrate to Israel that everything it's doing is unacceptable and the relationship will suffer as the result. So I think it's not only the United States that we think is extremely, is shirking its responsibility to these Palestinian communities. It's also the European Union. And there's a lot of lip service being paid to things like the two-state solution and the illegality of Israel's policies. But in terms of action, we see very little of it. I just wanted to add maybe one thing about the kind of like format here of us being Israelis who are talking about this issue. And I think that for me, at least, it's very clear that I'm never speaking on behalf of Palestinians in these events. But what I am doing is fulfilling my obligation as an Israeli to struggle, to speak out, to really resist my own country's treatment of Palestinians and its violation of their rights and everything that the Israeli apartheid regime is doing to Palestinians in the occupied territory. So we're not speaking for them. We work very often, I think, as Israeli activists in a very, very close way. And it's an incredible thing that you cannot take for granted. But I think that we have an obligation to speak also with communities that where Palestinians might not feel necessarily as comfortable. So this is why I'm here.
Thank you so much. I am seeing the time and I'm seeing the questions. I want to ask something that's come up for Oren. Can you hear me, Oren? I can't tell. Yes, you can. Okay, good. So wonderful. So I'm going to ask a question from the Q&A to you. And then I think I'm going to kind of direct us towards closing remarks that will have to do with what do we hope could happen from American government attention, just given the timing of this call and the fact that Joe Biden is there. But Oren, before we do that, I wanted to ask you to unpack a little bit more the incident with Basil Adra and how, from your perspective as a colleague in the same publication and a friend, I would assume, how should we understand what's happening to him as a photojournalist and a journalist and a documenter of the reality of his own place where he lives?
So, as you said, because Basil lives there, so he's basically meters away or kilometers away from every incident, from something small of confiscating something or like daily things that usually nobody documents and nobody gives attention. He's there. So the soldiers know him, the settlers know him, the commanders know him, and they're not happy about it, especially because it's not only on social media, it goes also to media, and from our media many times to mainstream media. So they're not happy about it. And this is why I think, at least, that he's being a target. And in this specific incident of Channel 12, the most popular channel in Israel, we saw how a specific soldier, a local commander that was also very violent towards Israeli and Palestinian activists there and was attacking them when they're trying to bring water to some of these communities, when he and his colleagues filmed something, they're just like saying, you just hear them saying, you try to set it on fire, when it was an area near a house that was set on fire because of a tear gas canister, actually. And there was no proof, but we're not surprised that the army, in cooperation with the settlers, are trying to do this. I contacted the army back then and I was insisting who released this footage to the media, and they they didn't want to take responsibility because, of course, as a soldier, you cannot just by your own initiative send videos. Maybe you can do, but it's illegal under army orders. But the more upsetting is that Channel 12, which later apologized, publicly apologized, broadcast it without even contacting Basel for a comment, for a response. So we see how like the dangerous cooperation between the army and the settlers on the ground also leads that it gets to some settler media outlets and then to mainstream media. And from our side, we're of course supporting Basel with the journalist unions, with ourselves, and we all with all the and with being with them on the ground. But of course, as he continues his job, this kind of attempts are continue. We always work to prove that they are lying and to protect them. But unfortunately, I think these things will continue. These attempts.
Yeah. So I'm going to move into our kind of like final closing remarks. I have been seeing the questions about B'Tselem's position about apartheid, about why Palestinians aren't initiating a peace negotiation, and all of these, which are important questions. I think if you're on this call, you probably have access to some of us, the organizers of this webinar from PIN, or some of the activists speaking. I'm not ignoring these questions because they're unimportant or because we don't have answers to them, but because I want to keep us focused on the topic of Masafer Yatta and the Joe Biden visit. But please feel free to reach out and we'll be happy to answer any questions about organizations positioning around terminology or actions on the ground or international work or any of the things that have been coming up into the Q&A that aren't specifically about Masafer Yatta. But I want to go into this kind of American, what can we do about it? And what are we hoping for in terms of what might happen here? And I'm going to start with you, Oren, and then Sarit, and then Roni. And I might ask you each of you a slightly different tack on this. So for Oren, like we're sitting here and 972 is like a source for us. Your reporting, your photos, your analysis from the ground. I read it and I like can't sleep at night. What are you hoping I'll do with that feeling? How can I help when I'm reading what you're writing, when I'm reading your reporting? What are you hoping we'll do when we feel those things and hear those things?
First of all, thank you for reading us and sharing. I think we all, the writers and the editors and the bloggers, we hope our articles are not just for people to read, but also to take action. Either it's in the US, in front of representatives or Congress people or Israeli institutions or anything. And also here, as we see many American Jews coming with different groups to hear, to visit, to hear, to witness, and to go back and tell. So for me, the photography, the writing is always a call to action in any level and in what anyone or each one of us can do. I want really in one word to say, because I saw a question about the grocery shop and it's important. So I think it was around Jimba. And of course it wasn't like a proper supermarket or shop. It was a small kiosk or shack that were selling grocery to the area. And of course today people have to travel kilometers to shop because Israel, as Sarit said, does not allow any building in the area.
Thank you so much. Sarit, as the primary person in B'Tselem working on international advocacy, what from your perspective would be a good outcome of Biden's visit? Let's imagine that we get what we want from Biden. All the J Street letters and APN actions and all of the webinars lead to something good happening from the American administration. What would that good thing be?
Well, I mean, I think it needs to be acknowledged by the American administration and by all of us that the current reality that we are looking at, trying to describe between the river and the sea, is a reality, an apartheid reality. And the United States needs to change its stance vis-a-vis this reality in order for the reality to change, right? We need to see much less of what we have been seeing, which is lip service to things like the two-state solution and some kind of future resolution. And we need to see much more of a willingness to actually utilize the relationship between the United States and Israel to get Israel to change its policies. And this, I think, is on, it's in a way a bit simplistic, right, to say these things. There's so many different issues that I could show. And let's maybe just talk about something that isn't specifically Masafer Yatta. I'll give an example from a different field, the killing of Shirin Abu Akleh, and how the United States, in its willingness to simply kind of like gloss over what has been happening, right? To accept the Israeli sham of it's not even an investigation, the sham of a debriefing that Israel has done in order to kind of like, just say, okay, let's move on, let's sort out the relationship and deprive the Abu Akleh family of truth and of accountability and of a way to actually obtain some tiny modicum of justice after such a loss. And this is just one example where the United States could have done something completely different. The United States could have forced Israel to provide actual evidence to back its claims that are not truthful, right? These claims, unfortunately, are lies. And the United States could have actually forced a proper investigation to, at the very least, obtain the truth, right? We know that Israel's investigative mechanism is a whitewash mechanism, but I'm just giving it as an example of something the US could have done and didn't do. It's a missed opportunity. When it comes to all the other, the other issues, I think one of the things that has struck me the most about the Biden administration's kind of planning in the run-up to this visit has been the request that was actually transmitted a few weeks ago to Israel to avoid surprises, right? To avoid things that will be kind of like problematic during the visit. And the worry is, I don't want to be too, I don't want to kind of like, make too much of this, but I think like at the risk of sounding a tiny bit demagogic, saying to Israel, simply to avoid things during the visit, while actually that is also in a way telling Israel that it's okay to do them once the visit is over. And the training in Masafer Yatta is a great example. Okay, so I mean, I appreciate very much that the residents would want to have a holiday and not have military training and live firing in their community during the holiday. But if the training is renewed next week after President Biden's visit, this means that this community is, going to be exposed to the same risk and the same pressure. And that's, a 1 week reprieve is just not going to cut it. Israel has to be told clearly and by the United States that these actions, and I can give you many, let's just give one more example.
No more examples. I'm so sorry, but we're way over time.
Construction in East Jerusalem, that's it, and then I'm done. And maybe one final thing for our US colleagues and friends and allies, you have your own struggles now within the Democratic Party where, AIPAC, which is supporting anything that the Israeli government does, supporting the occupation and supporting insurrectionists, is putting money into derailing the candidacies of wonderful progressive candidates. This is something that you guys need to be really strongly responding to because it's absolutely shocking. And I'm sure I have many other things, but please feel free if you have questions about B'Tselem's positions to email me, and Itamar will post my email there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarit. And I'm going to ask you, Roni, like kind of just where, I mean, I hear you. The main call here is move beyond words into action. That's and if the American administration would show the Israeli government and or military that it was serious about these statements and moving into action around them in this direction or that would feel like a positive outcome. Plus sort of changing our mindset about these issues also when it comes to the domestic echoes of them in electoral politics here and also there. So thank you for all of that. And towards that, and this is where we'll end with you, Roni, because I think there's the question of how international advocacy impacts legal work vis-a-vis the Israeli High Court. And there's also the fact that while we're thinking about the Israeli High Court of Justice as maybe or maybe not as independent as it likes to present itself, we're dealing with really similar questions here in the United States right now. And so where does our credibility begin and end in this context? And also, like, what would your positive outcome of a Biden visit be as the person here representing the sort of strategic litigation angle and the legal angle?
I think that first of all, I wouldn't trust the court ruling. I wouldn't say, well, it's in court now, let's wait and see what happens. Nothing will happen. This is not what changed the situation, and the situation will change only with a political decision of the Minister of Defense not to use this area as a firing zone. So I don't know whether what the judges are thinking of international community opinion. I know that Barak, who used to be when he was the chief judge, he was very much into developing the international humanitarian law, and this time in these times, the international humanitarian law is absolutely not present in most of the Supreme Court decisions. But I do think that when we don't have any conflicts, so we don't need court. And of course, the political side and the Minister of Defense, they are very sensitive to international point of view, and especially the US, and I'm sure that if US will be very concerned about what happened, not only in Masafer Yatta, but in a wide range of situation, it would make a difference. You're mute.
I was on mute. Sorry about that. Thank you, Roni. And I see the time. I see that we're over time. And I really want to thank all three of you for your time today and for your ongoing activism and partnership. Oren Ziv of Active Stills 972 Local Call, Sarit Michaeli of B'Tselem, Roni Pelli of ACRI, the Association for Civil Rights in Israel. Thank you for all of these important insights. And I want to say to everybody who joined us today, which are people all over the country and all over the world, you came into this call maybe through emails from me as New Israel Fund, or maybe from any number of other Progressive Israel Network groups. If you have further questions, if you want to get engaged on this specific issue, feel free to reach out to any of us who you are already in contact with, or those of us who are new, from Amenu, Americans for Peace Now, Habonim Dror, Hashomer Hatzair, Jewish Labor Committee, J Street, New Israel Fund, Partners for Progressive Israel, Reconstructing Judaism, and Trua. And you heard earlier that signed on to one of the congressional letters of today actually was also the Union of Reform Judaism, National Council for Jewish Women, and another group, which now I did not just say. I have lost that note. Sorry about that. Thank you everybody for joining. We will try to keep you posted. As I mentioned, J Street is releasing a issue brief about this today. 972 is ongoingly covering this. So there's no shortage of information and updates, and we'll try to make those as accessible as possible. Thank you so much. And we'll see you next time. Let's hope for the best with the Biden visit and what's to come next for residents of Masafer Yatta. Thank you.